por internet.
Muchas gracias, Moni. Bueno, le agradecemos muchísimo la intervención de Diana y sobre todo lo que nos acaba de confirmar con relación a lo que es todo lo que esta participación de las dos instituciones políticas como es la Iglesia y el Estado, que nos constata, digamos, cómo la parte legislativa sobre lo que es la diversidad genérica tiene y está montada sobre una sociedad muy contemporánea con todo un contenido de la Nueva España, ¿verdad? Así que ahora le daremos la palabra a Alan Greig. Alan Greig es maestro en ciencias que tiene que ver con los estudios sociales aplicados. Es un hombre experto con una vasta experiencia sobre el trabajo de violencia, VIH, SIDA con hombres, y él ha participado sobre el diseño y la planeación de estrategias preventivas, sobre programas, sobre capacitación. Ha publicado varios textos sobre esta problemática del trabajo con hombres, sobre la prevención, sobre el estudio, y me parece que será muy grato escucharle. Le damos la palabra a Alan Greig.
Buenos días. Discúlpeme, pero no hablo español, so I will be giving my presentation in English. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation and for putting on the conference itself, which has been fascinating for me. I'm not a public policy expert, so I come to this podium with both humility and curiosity. Having been granted the privilege of this presentation, however, I want to use it to raise some issues concerning men, masculinity and violence that I regard as critical. My understanding of these issues has developed from my work over the last 20 years on HIV/AIDS, gender and violence, mostly as an independent consultant working with non-profit organizations to support their work in the Global South, and as an activist working on issues of masculinity, violence and social justice in the USA. So I speak for myself, not as a representative of an institution, community or constituency. I also speak from the apex of privilege and want to say something about what this means to me given my understandings of the workings of power and privilege. Here as I am, I'm aware that I'm taking up space as men, especially men of my race, class, sexuality and age, are often criticized for doing. The criticism in my experience is often justified. So with all my privilege, I want to be conscious of how I enter and use this privileged space. I want to use the space to look at the implications of discourses on masculinity and violence for public policy on men's violence. The discourses I discuss are primarily Anglophone and primarily produced in the global north. So I make no claims about their universality, but I do see them as influential beyond the countries of their production and circulation, not least because of the role of northern institutions and policies in shaping, distorting public policy in the South. I also want to use this space because privilege and control can hide in silence. The privilege of political and economic elites and the control that they exercise are founded as much in their silence as in their statements and positions. The terms of debate are set by what is not said, sayable even, as by what is said. As much as we need to speak truth to power, we also need to speak truth from privilege, about what it is, how it works, and how it can be dismantled. In this, as in other instances, silence equals consent. I've been asked to consider the window of opportunity in relation to men, masculinities, and public policy. Given that opportunity is often said to be the other side of crisis, it is interesting that so much of the discourse of men and masculinities has been expressed in terms of crisis. I want to look at some ways that this language of crisis has been used to explain men's violence and to articulate responses to it. There are at least three types of crisis explanation that I've come across: the crisis of a destructive or violent masculinity itself, the violence provoked by an unachievable masculinity, and the violence that results from a frustrated masculinity. Writing in the Boston Globe newspaper on Sunday, May 2nd, 1999, about the events at Columbine High School near Littleton, Colorado, 12 days previously, which had left 15 dead and 23 wounded, Jackson Katz and Sut Jali emphasized that what these school shootings reveal is not a crisis in youth culture, but a crisis in masculinity. The lessons from Columbine High to these commentators were clear. The two young men who had killed that day were products of a masculine culture of domination and aggression in which the only way they could compete was through guns. This cultural crisis of destructive masculinity has become one of the ways in which public opinion and policy on men's violence has come to be framed. And it's not just confined to acts of interpersonal violence. In relation to the continuing US occupation of Iraq, US-based anti-violence activist Rob Okun asked over a year ago, will men step forward to end the masculine culture of violence? Will we be man enough, he writes, to envisage a world in which peace is the way? But it's just this challenge of men's inability to be man enough to which some have looked to explain men's violence. The crisis here for men and for the victims of men's violence is of an unachievable masculinity. Kimmel writes of masculinity as that which must be proved, and no sooner is it proved that it is again questioned and must be proved again. Constant, relentless, unachievable. Hearn and Whitehead state that men's violence to women appears to stem from the normal but impossible pursuit of manhood by men. Impossible because masculinity, they write, may be understood quite simply as heroism, whose key characteristic is courage that transcends fear of personal vulnerability. In this view, a man's domestic violence against a female partner, as they write, may be understood as a means of neutralizing her ability to reflect back to him his inability to conform to masculinity. Other commentators have argued that the crisis of an unachievable masculinity is not inherent within the construction of masculinity itself, but is specific to the conditions that confront men in their lives. This is a crisis of frustrated masculinity that can lead to men's violence. In searching for the roots of the crisis in the USA today, Susan Faludi found that men had been stiffed, the title of her book on the subject, by social and economic changes in US society. Sitting in on a batterers group in Long Beach, California, she came to the conclusion that there was something almost absurd about these men struggling week after week to recognize themselves as dominators when they were so clearly dominated, done in by the world. This explication of men's violence in terms of the paradox or sometimes contradiction of men's powerlessness has become common. Kaufman writes of the man who feels powerless who beats his wife in an uncontrollable rage. This talk of men's powerlessness seems a long way from the view of men's violence as an exercise in patriarchal power and control. So what are we to make of this? Some have argued that it is important to distinguish between the motivations for and effects of men's violence. Hearn and Whitehead note that the effect of men's violence is to serve patriarchy, but that it may seem absurd to assume that the individual man who batters his female partner is motivated by an ideological choice to cause her to conform to the gender category woman within patriarchal social relations. But is it absurd to assume that in a world of male privilege, men use a variety of means, including violence, to maintain this position? If men use violence to resolve the crisis that is inherent in the gulf between the power that they expect and the powerlessness that they experience, then this is